Hello everyone, today we talk about the military exploit of Henry V of England. It may sound incredible, but a medieval history-based channel medieval warfare channel even, with 2,500 videos and more has still not talked about Henry V. In part, that's because such figures are so sort of enormous in historiographical terms. Just think we've never made a video about the Battle of Agincourt alone, right? Of course, I'm going to produce something about that, both the sort of the times and meaning of the battle, as well as the tactical analysis. You know that on Schwerpunkt we take our time to do things pretty meticulously. But I thought that at the start of our biographical and military biographical history series, Henry V really represents a must. We are also to really cover a bit more in depth 14th, 15th century warfare. The other day I made a video about Braccio da Montone, for example, that was fighting exactly in the same years of Henry V. Very interesting times that require, through these people's profiles, an adequate military historical introduction. So there is a lot to talk about. We're not talking about Henry V as a whole. Probably we'll make another video about his reign, and so his figure also in broader terms. Today we focus on his military career. That, as you know, was quite intense. Henry V is one of the great sort of English, heroic kings in a knightly traditional sense that gets often overlooked also in traditional symbolism and spiritual metaphysical spirituality, other than, I don't know, look at this, technology of the armor and of the longbow that frankly is one of the least important things also in strictly military terms for anyone who reasons just beyond an individualistic and deterministic perspective and cares about the art of war. Naturally, a video like this is just an introduction to Henry V. Needless to say, again, we will make many more videos about Henry V's warfare, so to say. So Henry V of England, born on September 16th, 1386, at Monmouth Castle in Wales, would emerge as one of medieval Europe's most formidable monarchs, including from a strictly military point of view. In fact, his reign defined by his extraordinary war triumphs, but also diplomatic finesse. Henry was a very sort of picky, pragmatic, cold, and sort of resolute person, as well as a transformative impact on English national identity. For example, Henry was the first king after the Norman conquest to be fluent in actual English, as opposed to French, as it had been always spoken at the court. And in this relentless attempt, of course, of the English monarchs to reaffirm their rights in a way or another on the French crown, not just in France per se. We have to make more videos about the 100 Years' War, the incredible sort of complexity of this conflict from a dynastic and international point of view. As the eldest son of Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV of England and Mary de Bohun, and grandson of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, these were all Plantagenets, as you understand. He was born into the Lancastrian branch of the English royal house. His father's claim to the throne derived from being, in fact, the heir of Edward III's fourth son. So a distant compared to the direct rule of Richard II, placing Henry thus far from succession in his early years. All right, things are really messy. Again, we're going to skip that in a strictly dynastic sense, but of course, what matters here is that these guys' ancestors, their families, etc., was already one of the most distinguished royal houses in Europe, even in the some secondary branches, and much was expected of these individuals since birth, and especially in terms of martial exploit, with ancestors like Edward III, that is the greatest and most complete military genius in English history. The exact date of Henry's birth was actually long debated, some chroniclers proposing 387, as well. Records, however, confirm his parents' residence at Monmouth in 1386, coupled with the birth of his brother Thomas in autumn of 1387. And so basically 1386 was established as the definitive year. Henry's life was profoundly shaped by the political upheavals of late 14th century England, particularly the deposition of Richard II in 1399, which catapulted his father to the throne and elevated Henry, then 13, to heir apparent, setting the foundation for a reign that would reshape England's fortunes and leave an enduring legacy. The political instability of Henry's childhood began with his father's exile in 1398, following a dispute with Thomas Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, over accusations of treason. Even at 12, Henry was taken into the custody of Richard II, who treated him with surprising kindness, perhaps as a gesture to John of Gaunt, that was at that point like a powerful magnate, as well as Richard's uncle. In 1399, Henry accompanied Richard to Ireland, visiting Trim Castle, a key administrative and parliamentary centre, an experience that exposed him to the complexities of royal governance. The Lancastrian usurpation later that year, when Bolingbroke returned from exile, deposed Richard and claimed the throne as Henry IV, transformed Henry's status. Obviously enough, on November the 10th, 1399, he was in fact invested with a litany of titles: Prince of Wales, obviously as the heir apparent, as we've seen, of Henry IV, Duke of Lancaster, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, and Duke of Aquitaine, as well, formalizing his role as heir to a crown secured through conquest rather than unquestioned legitimacy, by the way. This sudden elevation thrust Henry into a world of factional rivalries, noble discontent, and the challenge of consolidating a usurped throne by his father. Henry's education was exceptional for a medieval prince. In fact, it reflected the intellectual ambitions of his Lancastrian family at that point in history. Under the guidance of his uncle Henry Beaufort, Chancellor of Oxford University and a legitimate son of John of Gaunt, he studied at Queen's College, Oxford, where he was immersed in music, literature, astronomy, and the English language as well. So as we were saying at the beginning, this made Henry the first English king since the Norman conquest to be fluent in the vernacular, a skill that later underpinned his administrative reforms and fostered also a burgeoning sense of national identity. We'll talk about that sort of legendary and metaphysical aspect of Henry's Englishness. His education extended beyond academics to practical governance as well, of course, as he attended his father's council meetings, observing the delicate balance of appeasing nobles, managing finances strained by war and rebellion, and navigating the legitimacy crisis of a usurped crown. By his mid-teens, Henry was entrusted with significant responsibilities already. This was fairly normal, at least for, a heir apparent in such a delicate situation and, achieving manhood, essentially, in terms of leadership and, as we'll see now, also military training and experience. But still a testament to his precocity and the confidence of his father's regime placed in him. Other princes were more sheltered and would rise to the throne or exit de facto political minority later on. At 14, we are in 1400, Henry was appointed High Sheriff of Cornwall, a largely ceremonial role that introduced him, however, to regional administration and the complexities of local governance. His first major test, however, came with the Welsh rebellion, led by the famous Owain Glendower, a nobleman who proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. This is the last great uprising in Welsh history for independentistic purposes. We are in September of 1400, seeking, in fact, independence from English rule. As you know, Wales had been properly subsumed by the English kingdom, right, as differently Scotland or also Ireland will be as remaining separated, crowned. Supported intermittently by French forces and fueled by Welsh grievances over taxation and land disputes, Glendower's revolt challenged the Lancastrian regime's authority from the Celtic fringe. Henry, tasked with coordinating royal forces in Wales, spent much of 1400 to 1408 engaged in a grueling campaign marked by guerrilla warfare, harsh terrain, and logistical difficulties. If you're interested in medieval Welsh warfare, I made videos from, say, especially the 11th to the 14th century. It's not like Welsh warfare changed particularly, as most of the Celtic fringes, and we're talking, as we just said, a deep sort of intense guerrilla warfare, ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and so on. That are really a strong form of war, as a matter of fact, and therefore committing here. We see also the Prince of Wales for several years, quelling the rebellion. It's in this phase that Henry was properly presented with the hardships of warfare firsthand. He oversaw sieges such as those at Conway and Harlech, and coordinated with regional commanders to counter Glendower's hit-and-run tactics. The campaign honed his skills in logistics, siegecraft, and irregular warfare, shaping his strategic approach to later clashes, even though this is also part of a broader tradition that we can explain better in the Clausewitzian videos, but that, of course, makes especially like medieval kings at this point in history very well versed in at every level of strategic involvement, right? If you think about, I don't know, how Harold Godwinson also had been fighting in the Welsh fringe as arming and instructing his men to fight in similar ways to the local Celts, as much as he fought as a Norman knight in France and an Anglo-Saxon lord in England. Now, by 1408, the Welsh rebellion was largely subdued, though Glendower remained at large until his death around 1415, leaving Henry with, however, invaluable experience that informed his future military endeavors, for which he would become so famous in medieval warfare. Regardless of the Welsh revolt, the pivotal moment of Henry's early military career had occurred on July the 21st, 1403, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, when he was only 16 years old. The battle was triggered by the rebellion of the Percy family, powerful northern magnates led by Henry, nicknamed Hotspur, Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland. The Percys had been instrumental in Henry IV's usurpation, but grew disillusioned over multiple grievances. Unpaid debts, for example, for their lent military service, unfulfilled promises of land in Cumberland, as well as the king's refusal to ransom Edmund Mortimer that had been captured by Glendower. So you understand these events were practically unrelated, and his retention of Scottish prisoners taken at the Battle of Homildon Hill in 1402, which the Percys claimed as their right to ransom. So a dispute over whom the line of command, like these prisoners, belonged. Hotspur, joined by his uncle Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester, and supported by skilled Cheshire archers and nobles like Lord Bardolph, raised an army estimated at 10 to 14,000 men, with the aim of overthrowing Henry IV and possibly installing Mortimer, whose claim to Richard II's line was stronger even due to his to the English throne due to his descent from Edward III's second son, so an older one. This northern rebellion was quite threatening the Lancastrian regime. Henry IV alerted to the rebellion on July the 12th of 1403, while marching to support the Percys against the Scots, because the Percys were essentially facing the northern neighbors, redirected his forces to Shrewsbury, a fortified town on the River Severn, where the rebels had attested themselves. The royal army, numbering approximately 12 to 15,000, included Prince Henry's contingent, which camped south of the River Severn, where negotiations happened, mediated by Thomas Presbyry, Abbot of Shrewsbury, and the Abbot of Oakmont. Negotiations that, however, collapsed when Thomas Percy accused the king of oath-breaking, escalating tensions because essentially royal honor was stained at that point and battle was basically unavoidable. In fact, the clash was fought in a pea field near Harfleur, later commemorated by Battlefield Church, began with a fierce archery exchange. All right, we have talked about the English armies of the 100 Years' War. In general, their tactics. Here we're looking at a clash between equals, essentially, or almost. The Percy's Cheshire bowmen, renowned for their precision, inflicted heavy casualties, with chronicler Thomas Walsingham vividly describing royal troops falling, quote, like leaves in autumn. So these were the initial skirmishes that, however, tested essentially the resolve, the morale of the contendants. Prince Henry, commanding the left wing of the English linear deployment, suffered, famously enough, a near-fatal injury when an arrow struck his face, its bodkin point lodging in his cheekbone. We know this pretty well, by the way, narrowly missing vital structures. All right, this was a massive and incredibly dangerous trauma. The royal physician, John Bradmore, I mean, imagine even just from a political point of view, your hair is being struck that way. Having exposed himself, by the way, quite unitly out there. It's not like they were without visors or whatever, but, you know, things happen when you receive so many arrows. This is a good example of the fact that armor is designed to block arrows, but you may never know how physics can play with you. And the royal physician performed a groundbreaking operation, showing, by the way, how good he was at that level. Of course, the king's surgeon, or better, doctor, documented in his medical treatise Philomena, using honey as an antiseptic, designing a specialized tool to extract the arrowhead for that particular wound and flushing it with alcohol, which makes a lot of sense, medically speaking, even by modern standards, with the means of the time, of course. The procedure, in fact, saved Henry's life, though permanent scars marked his face, a visible reminder of his battlefield ordeal. By the way, for all the movies that have been made about Henry V, also out of the Shakespearean inspiration and whatever, like always these actors with a clean, cool face, whatever. The guy has a freaking hole in his face, all right? And it would be sort of badass to represent in an actual movie. Now, despite his injury, Henry remained on the field, right, demonstrating remarkable courage and just incredible stamina for a teenager. This tells you how these guys were probably brought up, right, in their military training, in their nightly commitment. Again, shocking, traumatic psychophysical capacities. And it was a deeply important moral and political gesture, by the way, showing Henry's resolve and loyalty to the cause. The battle's turning point came when Hotspur led a desperate charge to kill Henry IV himself, briefly, in fact, succeeding even in overthrowing the royal standard and slaying its bearer, Sir Walter Blount. This was a major deal because these clashes, again, the English had habituated themselves to fight on foot, in also for political reasons. We've seen it also in the Wars of the Roses, given that this was a dynastic issue fundamentally. If you took out your opponent in front of you and you stood the ground, you had chances to get it over with and win it all. All right, and taking down somebody's, like in this case, the royal ensign bearer, naturally meant to create great panic, confusion on the battlefield, because just in moral terms, you know, the king's standard is down. It's not a good sign, and that's also probably a rally point in strictly tactical terms. We'll have to talk more about this. Nevertheless, and this is also very interesting, consider what had happened to Henry. Hotspur's death at least likely by an arrow to the face, so basically in the same way, ended the rebel momentum, right? And cries of Henry Percy King went unanswered, signaling his demise. These sides had been taunting one another with this kind of claims before, and you get, an arrow into your face, in your neck, whatever, as a response. And that's also a sign of God. That there is, we also started a series about Harold Hardrada, the issue of Harold Godwinson. There is some symbolic meaning in God's judgment receiving a bolt in your face, in your eye, in particular from heaven, that is basically killing your own providence. So the traditional sense of foreseeing the future, etymologically and theologically speaking, and so the one of being a sacred ruler with the capacity to mold the world in his own image. So, of course, the matter was settled here for the rise of Henry himself. That point, when Hotspur died, the royal forces rallied, securing victory by dusk. It had been a very hardly fought confrontation. We'll, by the way, make, again, a video for each of these battles. How we operate on Schwerpunkt. There's a pretty rich medieval battles, especially playlist. Shrewsbury is quite important as other battles of Henry V. Casualty estimates vary widely due, of course, to, say, chroniclers in the general issue, especially in England, because in other parts of Europe there was less feudal. They were less feudal. It wasn't much like a thing, but they were more courtly dependent, so to say, that had to write in favor of the monarch in more sort of flattering terms. But we can assess something like 5,000 possibly dying across both sides, with the royal army suffering significant losses. This was actually a pretty bloody battle for the time standards. We talk a lot about late medieval warfare in general. The armies, as we've seen, were not particularly large. In this case, they were, but just by the time standards. And the losses constituted a pretty strong segment of the war organic. The aftermath was brutal as well, by the way, for ideological, political reasons. Hotspur's body was in fact displayed in Shrewsbury's marketplace. This was also done, normally exposing the corpse of your rival after a battle was a way to dispel rumors of his survival. It was a way properly to show, also in a deeper, again, metaphysical sense, that this guy had not simply become a deus absconditus, right? There are other issues, like other big battles, including the one of Markville that I started a series on based on my old master thesis, where, at least in that case, Ottokar II's corpse was so disfigured that nobody could quite fully recognize him. And so the idea is, and I'm preparing a video exactly on this, is that this, as other holy rulers, and again, I made a video even about Ottokar, as far as that is concerned, would basically simply disappear, would hide but continue living, right, hidden to naturally rise again in the end time and or moments of trouble of the fatherland, just like, King Arthur for England. By the way, the Plantagenets, as we've seen also in the video about Edward I, were obsessed with Arthurian legions, regardless of the Celtic Romano-Brittonic background. In any case, the core, the body of Hotspur was quartered and sent to London and the four corners of the kingdom to show everybody what had gone on. So they were exposing London, York, Bristol, Chester, and Newcastle, right? So including areas that Percy had controlled. Thomas Percy was beheaded, and other rebels, including Sir Richard Venables and Sir Richard Vernon, were executed as well. So the Battle of Shrewsbury is one of the earliest to demonstrate, by the way, the concentrated effectiveness of the English longbowmen. At least it's one. We explained in other videos how this had come to being. The preeminence of the longbow is a bit overstated, right? We really did most thing were the men at arms for obvious reasons. Everything was a combined arm tactics. Basically all over Europe was the same type of tactics. It's not even about the longbow or the crossbow. There's really in practical terms, virtually no difference, right? But of course, the experience gained in this kind of clashes, right, was very important for, first of all, solidifying Lancastrian rule, even properly in blood, in arms, and as well as establishing Prince Henry as a capable commander, earning him admiration among nobles and chroniclers like Walsingham, who praised his valor for the terrible thing that had happened to him, and the way he had successfully come out of it, which was, again, a great also sign of divine favor. As also Henry fully recovered, at least in functional ruling and commanding terms, from that horrendous deturpation. As Henry IV's health deteriorated, by the way, from 1405, possibly due to a debilitating skin condition, there were lots of that time, but possibly a neurological illness, Prince Henry assumed increasing control over governance, because his father was really not capable anymore to tend to that. And in this, he was supported by his uncles Henry and Thomas Beaufort, legitimized sons of John of Gaunt, as we've seen. By January 1410, at 23 years old, Henry thus effectively led the Royal Council, implementing policies that often diverged from his father's more cautious approach. Again, Henry had a pretty sound, resolute character. Henry IV was actually not so different, but in the moment, at least, as we've seen, he was not so capable of pursuing even more decisive action. Henry's advocacy for renewed war with France, for example, aimed at reviving Edward III's claim to the French throne, and his opposition to the conservative influence of Archbishop Thomas Arundel sparked tensions. There was all contrast, naturally, between the regnum and the sacerdotium in England as well. Henry II, Thomas Becket, Dodged, so to say. These conflicts culminating in Henry's dismissal from the council in November 1411, amid rumors, likely spread by Arundel's faction, that the Beaufort urged Henry IV's abdication in favor of the prince. Such claims, recorded vaguely in sources like the St. Alban Chronicle, lacked corroboration and appear politically motivated. In fact, we don't know too much in that. We would think that English history, especially in later Middle Ages, there was a greater shrinking, even in literary output to a degree, especially in terms of actual open political assessment. We know better paradoxically about 13th century rulers, as we've seen also about Henry III, Edward I. And now Henry's association with Sir John Oldcastle, a Lollard, by the way, sympathizer at least, who advocated religious reform. This was a moment, as you know, pretty significant social religious movement and rebellion act. And his reformist leanings may have fueled later myths of a wayward youth, famously dramatized by Shakespeare in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. This is unlikely in general, while there may have been an alignment with these populistic, heretical movements. This is just a matter of speculation, depending on how, especially against whom this could be directed. Instrumentally, this had historically already happened in certain cases, but it's not like such a firm man of integrity like Henry, with his very strong monarchic awareness in an imperial Catholic sense, would have simply accepted, if not as a pawn in a lower sense. In fact, contemporary accounts, such as those of Bishop Richard Courtenay, emphasize Henry's discipline, piety, and focus on governance, refuting tales of debauchery. Right, extremes may have been a thing, a way to test limits, whatever. The guy was young, but already at this point, right, he demonstrated pretty cold nerves, pretty solid iron fist that may have caused, again, political enmity, but not like this sort of degeneration. In 1412, Henry also reconciled with his father, arriving in London with a large retinue to dispel rumors of disloyalty towards the king and secure his position as his father's heir, a move that demonstrated also his political acumen at that point, so full commitment to monarchic loyalty. Upon Henry IV's death on March the 20th, 1413, Henry ascended the throne as Henry V, crowned on April the 9th at Westminster Abbey during a fierce snowstorm, interestingly enough, which chroniclers interpreted as an omen of either divine favor or impending strife, which would both turn out to be true. Let's think the man, in a physical sense, given his, as we've seen, also martial prowess, Henry stood over 6 feet tall. He was lean, with cropped dark hair and a ruddy complexion, scarred, remember, horrendously scarred from Shrewsbury. He had a demeanor that could shift from serene to fierce, right? He was essentially cold, right, and maintaining his charisma, reflecting a commanding presence that inspired both loyalty and fear, right? These traits are very important in his role. His reign faced 3 immediate challenges, by the way. Restoring domestic stability after years of rebellion, as we've seen. Addressing the Lollard schism that threatened religious unity. I explained how, of course, heresy, in the sense pacifism, by the way, that are all antithetic to any kind of traditional European identity and imperial Catholic tradition. And, by the way, reasserting England's diminished prestige in Europe, because naturally England had somehow, historically, at least under Edward III, the 100 Years' War had brought an important coming back on the continent. However, the crisis of the mid-14th century had deeply contracted things. The English had lost further ground. And so now bringing the war again onto the continent was a great ambition of the English establishment in general, right? That would also favor the monarchy as far as, ravaging somebody else's land without sort of letting out any kind of tension ambition into someone else's country rather than home. We will talk more also about all the various noblemen that had historically acted. We've seen it also in the videos about the free companies to essentially ravage France on their own, right, in a knightly errant, but also in entrepreneurially successful fashion. We have seen also the consistency of the English armies during the famous chevauchée, right, quite devastating business. Henry pursued a policy of reconciliation to stabilize the domestic situation, his personal rule. For example, he reinterred Richard II with honors at Westminster Abbey to distance himself from his father's usurpation. So a sort of reconciliation also with some political rivals, and in this sense conferring more prestige and continuity, not just to his reign, but to the monarchy, right? If you have read Kantorowicz, you know that it's the English that really developed further the concept of the fact that the crown never dies, like the king as a person distinct from, as an office essentially distinct from the individual person, is a metaphysical being. And again, this actually is already the partition for the more traditional unity of the two things, historical, but it would be also an important way to conceptualize political continuity, the legitimacy of the crown. Henry also restored titles to nobles disadvantaged under Henry IV, such as the Percy family, so his former rivals that had suffered, by the way, greatly, as we've seen, in quite vicious, violent ways of the royal revenge, in favoring figures like Edmund Mortimer, whose claim to the throne had been a rallying point for rebels, so keeping him, good in a sense. However, Henry dealt decisively also with threats to his authority. That, of course, would have been just treason, and you just put down by massacring anyone as it's proper. In January 1414, for example, he crushed a Lollard uprising, because it's just, I don't know, people today, making a mess for Palestine. You know how to deal with that. This uprising had, by the way, been led by Henry's former friend, Sir John Oldcastle, we mentioned before, who sought on that occasion to overthrow the monarchy and establish a Hussite-inspired theocracy, which had not gone very well in Bohemia. We talked multiple times about the Hussite. The worst had yet to come in the Czech lands, but as you know, it was a complete disaster. The country was basically wiped out and lost its independence thanks to this debauchery of disgusting heresy. Bohemia lost all its historical prestige that was incredibly high, by the way, in the 14th century. The rebels, numbering perhaps 1,000, we're talking this Lollard uprising against Henry, gathered at Saint-Gilles in the fields, but Henry's forces dispersed them swiftly as the rabble that they were, capturing and executing their leaders. Perfect behavior. Oldcastle escaped, but was eventually captured in Wales and executed as well in 1417. Signaling the rightful intolerance and religious dissent by Henry, that again did not even, of course, have any sympathy for this depraved heresies against the imperial Catholic traditional rule. In July 1415, Henry thwarted the Southampton plot as well. This was a conspiracy orchestrated by Richard, Earl of Cambridge, Henry Scrope, and Sir Thomas Grey to place Mortimer on the throne. So this had been, in fact, perhaps a mistake, leaving the latter so more autonomous, but it was just not to go full tyrannical in a sense. In any case, this conspiracy gave Henry the legitimacy to act decisively here too. Uncovered just before Henry's departure for France, the plot led to the conspirators' execution, reinforcing his control and deterring further challenges. So perfect conclusion for also securing greater stability in England, so having a safe, sound home during the great exploit in France. These decisive actions ensured thus domestic stability, allowing Henry to focus on his foreign ambitions. Henry's domestic policies were in a sense transformative, emphasizing administrative efficiency and the cultivation of a nascent English national identity. This aspect is relevant because the early English victories in the 100 Years' War under Edward III, his son, the Black Prince, we've seen, by the way, the Battle of Poitiers, one of the most beautiful battles to historically and tactically reconstruct, amazing, were due to a great political efficiency that we will see better how it had been built, especially by by Edward III. You cannot have the strongest army in history in terms of repeated victories in numerical inferiority in conditions of symmetry like the English one of Edward III, so to say, and the one of Henry V in historical perspective, if you don't have a quite efficient state, capable government, and so on. This is very complex. That's why the longbow literally had barely anything to do with that in a technological sense in the outcome. And Europe was gradually sort of reemerging from the depths of the second half of the 14th century crisis after the plague and all those issues that we've seen also in general, like as far as this, for example, radical movements, the free companies, especially in France, and things were gradually stabilizing. So as we've seen, the same Henry had to struggle to reinforce his rule, also with iron-fisted policies, but they succeeded, and they helped him in creating the army with which he would score the successes we will browse now. Henry pioneered the use of English in government. This was, again, in a national sense, very important because it was as typical of the essentially nationalization of later medieval monarchies. We made lots of videos on this topic. The increasing territorialization and regionalization of power, together with, again, a stronger oligarchy and state in that sense, partially overlapping, become conducive for, especially in an English perspective, as explained, like waging war across the Channel, which was a pretty viable way to score broader points both at home and internationally, showcasing an English coming back as risky as it was. Telling the truth, we rightly remember victories like Crécy, Agincourt, the same Poitiers we talked about before, as okay, well, the English simply got it. But you have to think that any defeat, even in just one of these battles, would have created massive political institutional issues in England. The monarchy could have wavered. So it was still an incredibly edgy and risky business, but one that did help stabilizing England, at least through these successes. That's why, for example, I don't know, there is an important crisis with the Wars of the Roses as the consequence of the end of the 100 Years' War. And that would actually, by the theoregenesis of the ends, end up stabilizing government with the decimation of the House of Lords for the Tudors. But that's another story. We've seen also Tudor warfare in that lens. But definitely the defeat in the war was not a good thing for England, as you know, the Battle of Bouvines had not been a good thing for England. In fact, we explain even the Magna Carta in that lens. Yes, today we are thankful for England to have risen to the levels it did, also thanks to the Magna Carta. But in the moment, the Magna Carta is just the product of a disaster. It's not really something, and it's along the pattern of essentially common law constitutions as they existed all over Europe. So it's not even a particularly English thing just per se. It was just sort of crippling for the monarchy in a way after a level of enormous power that actually the English crown had compared to other to most Western European kingdoms back in the day. It's just a digression, but it's important to see this in perspective also in terms of, for example, Henry's coming back in this phase, the Lancastrian phase of the 100 Years' War, because it's not sort of morally and politically as ideally separated from all this trail of events. Henry adopted Chancery Standard English in official documents to stiffen national cohesion. That he did also in his personal correspondence, a significant departure from the French and Latin that had dominated since 1066. This linguistic shift, evident in letters such as those to the city of London in 1417, made Henry I king to fully embrace the vernacular that was naturally spoken by the other English kings, but not to the, say, as a primary language. And still, of course, Henry was doing it instrumentally. This fostered a sense of Englishness that resonated with his subjects in a way that had not happened since the time of William the Conqueror. Economically, Henry maintained tense relations with the Hanseatic League, made a video about the Hanseatic League, and this was, as you know, a powerful trading confederation that had mobbed basically the entire North Sea in terms of, you know, trade, colonies, and whatever, and say essentially blackmailing various governments, precluding the access to their markets, if not properly accepting particular, not conferring particular privileges to the Hanseatic League and so on. But at this point, Henry was powerful, and he allowed for this successful for this reason, London to impose taxes on foreign merchants. So mostly these Germans that were quite present on especially the English, the East Coast, and a policy that strained trade, but also bolstered royal revenue for that matter, because the Londoners' sort of third estate oligarchy was quite powerful and could subsidize in this sense. The monarchy grew closer to it for also Henry's military exploits were enormously costly. Henry's judicial reforms strengthened royal authority with justices of the peace appointed to enforce order locally. Police reducing reliance on fractious nobles, right, with a more centralized approach, therefore, against the barons. The absence of major rebellions after 1415, in particular, attests to the success of these policies. And naturally, were also the consequences we've seen of brutal warfare, and so also the decapitation of so many English noble rebels, in creating a stable foundation for Henry's military campaigns, for which he will become so famous. Henry's overriding ambition was, of course, to revive England's claim to the French throne. This was the most important horizon of English rulers at this point. Also a legacy of Edward III's assertion through his mother, Philippa of Hainaut. I made a video about medieval Hainaut recently, so you can check that out as well, which the French rejected, of course, under Salian law, barring female succession since the time of the Merovingians, and working differently in the English interpretation of the various dynastic successions. Negotiations in 1414 and 1415 were Henry demanded vast territories as a provocation, like Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, Flanders, Touraine, and Aquitaine, so even bigger than the Angevin imperial legacy of the 12th century, in fact, encompassing the Low Countries as well. I partially discussed Flemish politics and function of English support in some videos, especially for the first half of the 14th century. Also a 1.6 million crown ransom for the French King John II, and that, as you know, had died in prison after the capture of the Battle of Poitiers, and marriage to Princess Catherine collapsed when France offered only an enlarged Aquitaine and 600,000 crowns. The French were having issues, including the mental illness of the King Charles VI. We'll talk about him in this crucial moment. The English flirt with Burgundians that will, in fact, successfully bring to the conquest of Paris and so on. Undeterred, Henry secured parliamentary support with a double subsidy for the war, reflecting his ability to rally the commons and nobility to his cause alike. Everybody had a bit to earn from this. The nobility, the barons, new lands in France, some of which were their atavic ancestral ones. As we've seen for the English, especially the London merchants, acquiring an enormous sway over basically the Channel, North Sea trade, unprecedented level. This was the right moment, right? There was enough political stability and consequent also revenue for attempting this massive as risky investment. On August the 13th, 1415, Henry launched his first campaign, landing at Schwerpunkt with an army of approximately 12,000, including 2,300 men-at-arms and 9,000 archers. So a fairly small, compact force, right? But an orderly one, a professional one. Again, I made multiple videos about medieval English armies, especially the ones of the 100 Years' War. We'll come back on the topic. This was transported by a fleet of up to 1,500 ships. You notice, by the way, how many archers in general next to the men-at-arms. Of course, there were other heavy infantrymen as a whole, but sometimes it seems almost as if that was the duo de pair. Henry's initial target was Harfleur, a strategic port in Normandy, critical especially for controlling maritime trade and military access from England to sort of as a bridgehead for further expeditionary forces. The siege of Harfleur would be, in fact, a major feat of Henry's. Began on August the 18th of the same year, marked the first significant English use of gunpowder artillery against a fortified town. Just recently made a video about late medieval Western artillery warfare. As you know, the English had been among just more or less gunpowder weapons like spread evenly everywhere. But England had made an early precocious use in the campaigns, in fact, of Edward III in France as well. And this technological innovation complemented this other, again, the English system was necessary in siege warfare. And it witnessed, again, some scholars would like to make of this, again, a huge deal. Again, the longbow artillery, again, all Western armies work exactly in the same ways. Missile weapons, crossbows, longbows, it's virtually the same thing. The French garrison of Harfleur, led by the Lord of Estouteville and the one of Gaucourt, was reinforced by 300 men-at-arms and resisted fiercely, prolonging the siege for over a month. The century known as the Bloody Flux, let's not dig into the reason, but you're aware of that. Also because famously at Agincourt, the English army was still suffering, and that there are pretty sort of graphic descriptions of what was going on in that battlefield due to this illness. Ravaged the English army with losses estimated at 36 men, based at least on Anne Curry's analysis of sick lists. We talked about this pink flows, red flow, also in the video about the Battle of Vienna, 1689. It's unrelated, but in general, it shows how frequent this was in the broader times. To as high, by the way, because that's the point, you would say just 36 men. Some say 5,000. At least chroniclers like Titus Livius, which is naturally a nickname for this humanistic temper. And it would be normal, actually. More people could die of illness in these campaigns than through probably violent trauma. But higher figures than this are likely exaggerated. And they could be just provided without many ways to check, like further medieval records. Again, you would think, that medieval England at this point is pretty well intensely documented. Compared to other areas in the West, not much, really. The disease claimed, however, nobles like Bishop Richard Courtenay and forced Henry to send thousands of sick soldiers back to England, weakening his force considerably. Despite these challenges, Harfleur surrendered on September 22nd, 1415, under terms allowing French knights to be paroled for ransom and loyal townspeople to remain under English rule. If you're interested, I made videos on both the Duchy of Normandy, proper, and what was going on politically within this French fief, and that at this point was increasingly alienated from the English sympathies that he had historically maintained for a while, regardless also of Capetian authority and authoritativeness, and medieval siege warfare in general, realizing how siege warfare actually happened, and we will talk more about this, if anything, in other videos better. Henry left at Harfleur a garrison of 300 men-at-arms and 900 archers, which was, especially in terms of men-at-arms, really a considerable force to hold this town that, as we have realized, was a strategic foothold on the Channel. Rather than return to England, Henry made a bold decision to march towards Calais, which is also not too close. This was an English-held port, right? And the objective was basically to launch a chevauchée across, like along the French coast, to assert his claim on the region and provoke, of course, the French in some way. Naturally, this was recipe for trouble, but it was also the major political and strategical display for which Henry had strived in the past years. Crossing the Somme River after evading French defenses at Bethencourt and Wyann, his army, now reduced to about 9,000 due to disease and garrison commitments, was intercepted, famously enough, by a French force of 14,000 to 24,000 at Agincourt on October the 25th, 1415. Again, the Battle of Agincourt really needs an immense coverage. I will make multiple videos on this battle. We, I think, partially covered even some aspects of it already in other videos, obviously enough. In this video, I will not digress too much on the big historiographical, methodological, and sort of cultural issues, especially in the reconstruction, what actually happened. There's a beautiful sort of mythology revolving around that, which is plausible. Nevertheless, let's say also a bit too much embroidered, let's say, compared also to other clashes that didn't receive so much coverage. As you understand, this was also kind of a small battle. I have my, let's say, grievance towards bigger channels like Kings and Generals, saying like, why were medieval battles so small in citing, Agincourt as the fort of, two great Western monarchies like England and France, as saying, look, there were all these limited. People reason in terms of basically armies were actually small. I made a video last spring providing with the entirety of 10,000 plus, for example, Italian communal armies in the first half of the 14th century. They're over 70. And we're looking at repeated numbers of 30,000. They're all much also better documented and confirmed that even this most famous theater, most people don't realize these perspectives, these proportions, these quantities, because, again, everybody knows Agincourt for the obvious Anglo-Saxon echo across sort of world pop culture and so on. I can't say it's just a self-referential thing, because it was a very important and a hell of a battle, by the way, by all means, by all standards. But it's not the only one that is worth taking in consideration, and it's not just like the only thing, or even among just the most important things in absolute terms that were happening in Western warfare at the time. For also hinging narratives like, look at the Battle of Agincourt is so important, just, the English had here the numbers where they're just estimates, they're profitably debatable, just 9,000, whatever. Doesn't mean there were English battles that witnessed 30,000 men, and that are not so sort of considered in a broader sense, and these smaller clashes, numerically speaking, are often taken out the gold standard for what medieval warfare would know, right? Especially the later Middle Ages, especially the mid 14th century crisis, are often taken as this progressistic explosion of infantry, of tactics, of technology, and so you would expect size. And so you think, so everything that came before was less than this. It's a completely debunked narrative that does not properly hold any ground in front of any history of the art of war by medieval, say, chronological and properly quantitative standards. But unfortunately, people just keep repeating this over and over again. They don't study any other battle, and it's all about some sort of identitarism, not much any kind of objective historical accuracy that can be achieved, as a matter of fact, if one just takes the time to be a bit more diachronic and comparative. This is not to downplay the Battle of Agincourt, that is immense and beautiful, and the pop culturalization of which has, of course, brought on the force some also spiritual aspects of English in English nationalism as well, in different ways of seeing this, again, champion king and his religious devotion. The entire sort of, Shakespeare helped very much. St. Crispin's speech and etc. are really very hallowed and sort of incredibly poetic and beautiful and really expressive of those time standards. But in many ways, all battles were kind of like that, and we tend to forget this aspect. I hope on Schwerpunkt to sort of widely expand this perspective also for the rest of Europe. The Battle of Agincourt was fought in a narrow, muddy defile between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt. It's like, I don't know, other places like Bouvines or Crécy, there's literally nothing, right? These places are completely anonymous. They have nothing in particular, but they came to be the theaters of some of the most important clashes in medieval history. which I find is an aspect that I find very beautiful. How and why, especially studying campaign strategy, etc., what these points specifically come to host, how did it come to be fought there. Today we don't have the time again to digress in that strategic picture. We will surely make videos about just the campaign of Agincourt. This would become one of the most deservedly also celebrated victories in English history, showcasing the devastating power, not much of the longbow, but of the combined armed tactics of a tendentially professional force like the English one really was, under a hell of a commander, great moral forces with great discipline and very wise terrain choice, also a proactive attitude, because the French, as you know, sort of sit there for a while, and it was the English in this numerical inferiority that even set forth and provoked them into the attack. The myths, again, of the longbow killing everybody, or, you know, even just being decisive, it's complete nonsense. It's not evidenced by any source whatsoever, not just about the Battle of Agincourt. We've seen it very well at the Battle of Poitiers, as a matter of fact. The sources are completely uninterested in this aspect, and they absolutely do not, because nobody at the time would even reason like that, and they knew much better than us, of course, how things worked in terms of technologism and this other mental diseases that the mentally frail need to use today to believe that the world, they live in a world in which they can't control everything just because they can't. Studying von Clausewitz really helps, also mental health. Henry deployed approximately 1,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 archers. Again, here we're just throwing these numbers that, again, are plausible, but again, at some point we will make also a video about the numbers at the Battle of Agincourt. We've done it for Bouvines, if anything, for the deployment of the armies only, so we are starting to enter that phase of Schwerpunkt. We have enough in-depth content for these topics choices. These forces were commanded also by among others, by the veteran Sir Thomas Erpingham. They're talking the longbowmen in particular, with sharp stakes protecting the flanks to deter French cavalry that was, however, severely understrength there. The notion is that the stakes stopped the French or the archers did, but as a matter of fact, it was a mix of forces, including the fact archers had means to protect themselves in hand-to-hand combat. They weren't just archers, by the way. So the narrative gets often blurred, and if you actually make a research about the whole sources of the battle and you exercise yourself in understanding what actually, the actual reconstruction, you realize that there is no edge for the technologistic narrative whatsoever. It's just a deliberate ideologistic choice crafted for, stupid positivistic, progressistic myths, especially in the 19th and 20th century. Now, the French, and this is, by the way, a compliment to the English, because there is no magic weapon that solves the thing. This is just massive attributes, all right? Massive manly attributes. And it's not like the French sucked at all. They were a hell of an army, and they even did essentially what they had to do. There was no the Battle of Waters' disaster was a heavy French defeat, but it was no fundamental mistake in absolute terms that, I'll look at these idiots that got themselves thrown. No, it was, wisely fought battle, and odds are balanced for reasons that normally, again, the average person definitely does not understand better. Not even elite person understand better than a 15th century French or English men-at-arms. The French, led by the Constable Charles d'Albret and Armagnac, to pro-royal, because this was the royal army, nobles like the Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon. I made a video about the House of Bourbon, if you're interested, by the way, were hampered by rain-soaked terrain, which turned the field into a quagmire, because they were eventually the ones who launched the full-scale attack on the English. Doesn't matter how sort of recklessly close these had advanced to provoke, in fact, the French, successfully so, in fact, and by their dense, heavily armored formations, right, relatively ill-suited to the muddy condition. I mean, it's not like the battle was lost because of the mud. It's the terrain. These guys knew how or where to fight, even if hasty decisions could have been made, some general misunderstanding was made. These armies were designed to fight in the muddy terrain. It's not like, I don't know, yes, the English were, say, advantaged by the defensive position, but in general, it's not like the Mediterranean was so great for them and their combined force. In fact, there is a moment in which they thought really that they would have been overrun. Also, after the slaughter, they didn't know whether there were other French battle lines out there. We've seen how, for example, the Battle of Poitiers had unfolded in relatively similar ways. The battle began with an archery barrage with English longbowmen positioned. This is the other contentious thing in a concave formation. Now we've explained what the Herse is in last spring's series about the English armies of the 100 Years' War. Formations were symmetric. There is no actual advantage in having some sort of concave formation. Like the wings of this light troops, and also heavy ones, by the way, because mostly it's the men-at-arms in the center, and the wings also have heavy infantry, would eventually have the possibility of closing themselves on the enemy flanks when the enemy wings collapsed. But the notion that there was a prearranged formation is extremely concave formation is incredibly contentious, and even just in a strictly military logical sense, not giving any particular edge per se. Literally, armies were much more flexible than you think, and on a regular basis with an incredibly high level of uniformity. In any case, the volleys disrupted the French vanguard order. At least they helped bogging them down. It was always the heavies that, however, brought the things to the final conclusion. The French cavalry charge intended to break the archers on the wings, because the French had already suffered of those, and they thought rightfully that heavy cavalry would overrun missile troops. Faltered against the stakes, at least, or better. The actual, as we've seen, wings that didn't contain even just archers, but actual heavy infantry. Apparently, the French were so sure to win that they were under strength. The French, we explained also in videos about French army organization at this point why the French had the problems they had in open field against the English. It was mostly a greater problem of army reform, lack of homogeneity, difficulty in enforcing some standards on such an enormously large force at some point across the entire country, especially after the ravages of the first time of the 100 Years' War. There have been actual reforms. We discussed this, including, I made a video about the French countermeasures, that if you watch, like, you understand how make this battle so very unpredictably random, even in the actual outcome, right? The odds were very well balanced. It's not like the French had to lose just per se, and the English had to fight pretty darn hard in order to defeat the French. If you take that away from the account, you take away all the English valor and capacity from it. The main, also the notion that, again, the longbowmen were this capable of penetrating armor close, right? Some would, but the missile light infantry does not do that, right? When these guys are stopped, they're stopped by heavy infantry, now where they're not including longbowmen and sitting their sports, which at this time were also relatively cheap to have also for the lights, but they weren't just bowmen, and so we should really be, and if you actually read the sources, you realize that the sources say very different things in very different ways, and so you don't exactly get to acknowledge what actually happened, right? But in terms of military logic and by analogy with all the caution of the case, you can't get to sort it out. The main French assault, comprising 4,800 men-at-arms, which is a lot, in the vanguard and 3,000 in the main battle, advanced slowly through the mud, becoming at least easy targets for the archers that mostly disrupted their order, not much caused particularly high number of losses. The greatest clash was in the typical fashion between the battle lines of men-at-arms in the center, and sources tell us explicitly, like in every other battle of the time, by the way, that the most intense part of the clash was decided there fundamentally. Always in combined arms. It's not like the archers were influent in that, but again, it's not like the longbowmen had any greater merit than any other, missile troop in other armies. It was mostly about the combination of the two, right? As the French reached the English lines, as they obviously did, hand-to-hand combat ensued, with Henry fighting personally to protect his wounded brother Humphrey. If anything, at some point we could talk about him, the Duke of Gloucester, and surviving, by the way, an axe blow to his helmet that dented its crest. Right, this clash was incredibly physical. There is a reason, by the way, these guys are equipped that way. It's not a dirty longbowman that downs these veritable tanks on the battlefield. That's not probably what the art of war is about. Longbows are not machine guns. The French attack, after much struggle, collapsed under the weight of their own numbers. At least the relative disorder had been created across the traversate, the crossing of the muddy field under longbow hit that had disordered the heavies, the heavy infantrymen, the dismounted men-at-arms, that therefore were less ordered and more fatigued than their English counterparts, right? It should be pointed out that the French were actually fresh. They had time for breakfast. So the odds were actually balanced. The English found themselves in pretty dire conditions, also logistically, with the sickness ravaging the army. As you know, Henry's decision probably to... In fact, he was slowed down by all this. He decided to stop his army and stand his ground against the full might of the French royal army. This is also what makes this battle so badass in a broader strategic sense. If anything, it's when melee ensues that the English wings successful against the French ones. That's actually what brings to this kind of consequences on the battlefield, of outcomes. They could close on the French flanks, and so at that point it was not even about shooting them at close range. It was also engaging into hand-to-hand combat, and just that psychologically being outflanked is essential, right? The French men-at-arms would resist for a while because they were trained to do that, but eventually would crumble under pressure. This is how it actually happened, and in this sense, Agincourt is not really unique by any means. Basically, all battles fought in the 13th and 14th century worked in this fashion. So the notion that here the longbows, again, were unique, well, again, take it from me, I'm a PhD in medieval warfare, and I specifically reconstruct battles. The entire notion, again, that the longbow had any, distinctive merit compared to other Western European missile forces as they regularly operate is complete BS. It's a complete modernistic fabrication. It doesn't find any trace of evidence out there. Of course, these troops did kill, they did make it in combined arms tactics. So it's not to deny that. They denied the uniqueness of this kind of achievement that, in a sense, also the English had to magnify historically for different reasons, but that has nothing to do with the actual medieval art of war for how we finally understand it today. At least I'm one of the few people who actually studies this, right, and not some sort of abstract military history, the actual art of war, how armies actually fought on the field, and in an abstract sense, talking about logistics or whatever, still confusing that as sort of the most important. It's always the deterministic narrative, by the way, always behind that. It's always about that mental frailty, typical of the last generation's psychological profiles. But let's not digress further. Nothing to do with the mental granitic soundness of the men who fought in that, especially the men-at-arms in these clashes. There's also Henry's controversial order to execute thousands of French prisoners. As we were saying before, this stemmed from fears of a counterattack by the French rearguard, which appeared to rally. And you really don't know what's going to happen in those moments. So yeah, it made sense because there were so many French prisoners captured that you couldn't physically restrain them in case a French line would have attacked once again. Henry spared only high-ranking noblemen like the Duke of Orleans for ransom, because these were probably the top de facto royalty. I mean, they were highest nobility of France. In any case, it was a practically understandable thing. It's not like Henry wanted to shed much French blood in that sense. It would have been better to capture, ransom, etc. But he was risking, like, probably his entire army wiped out, his own death, his own capture. So that was actually a sound, wise decision. Chronicles like Lefebvre, Monstrelet, etc. noted English concerns about being overwhelmed, which is kind of obvious because a battle like that is, again, pretty well balanced in odds by the size of forces and the general criticality of the clash. Though at least the decision of slaughtering all these French prisoners definitely drew criticism for its brutality, right? Especially like the aristocrats, etc. It was not normally done at the time, and it stemmed only from some strategic consideration. The victory was catastrophic for France, with 6,000 to 15,000 dead, allegedly including 3 dukes, 9 counts, and numerous noblemen. De facto decapitating the French military elite. In the moment, English losses were remarkably low, which is consistent with the broader battle dynamic for how we can reconstruct it, with at least 112 confirmed dead, including the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk, by the way, which shows, again, the head-on role of these leaders among their men-at-arms, and so how hardly fought the battle actually was. It's completely normal to have, again, all this kind of dead and captured among the defeated when the formation breaks, and as you know, you can't capture all. Here, many Frenchmen were also exhausted of the fight. They would, especially the men-at-arms, this is notorious, they at some point exhaust, not just them at Agincourt, but in general noblemen. Especially armor, as you know, was becoming ever heavier. Plate was gradually fully taking over. It was very sort of ergonomic, anatomic, etc., but it's still considered like it entailed an enormous exertion, especially under such stressful psychological conditions. And to be honest, chroniclers like the Gesta Enrici Quinti, that is also, well disposed towards Henry, suggest higher figures for English losses, which would also be consistent with the sheer brutality of the clash. This was nevertheless a triumph. Agincourt's victory, achieved against overwhelming odds, boosted English morale like hell, because basically this was, as we've seen, a fairly small force in line, as we've seen, with the pretty limited amount of troops that the English used for their chevauchée, out of which this kind of clashes occurred, like smaller English army skirting the fringes of the French domains. Big royal army intervenes, gets defeated because the English take up a defensive position because they're actually strategically desperate in that situation. The French are actually superior, but they get bottled up, and out of the struggle they emerge defeated. Because also the value of the various commanders, as a matter of fact, we're talking great leaders at all, like Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. So it's not sort of, again, nothing was predetermined, otherwise the battles would have neither been fought. Agincourt was also a majorly political and strategical victory for different reasons. First of all, it legitimized Henry's claim to the French throne. It inspired a wave of patriotic fervor, opening de facto an enormous series of opportunities. As we will see now, de facto the English and the Burgundians will overrun northern France later on, but as a consequence of this major French defeat. Henry returned to London on November the 23rd, because as we've seen, the campaign had already started fairly late in the season. And that was not something to be kidded with. As we've seen, the English army was also exhausted, de facto. On this occasion, in London, Henry was greeted with triumphal pageantry, including processions and pageants that celebrated him as a conquering hero, a great champion of chivalry, immense monarchic sort of knightly display in the full tradition of sort of imperial Catholic achievement of sacred royalty, etc. Diplomatic efforts followed Agincourt as Henry sought to capitalize on his victory, even without too much of a military involvement. That was, again, also very costly in general. In 1416, Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg visited England himself to negotiate peace between England and France, right, as a medium, basically. This move was aligned with, by the way, the Holy Roman Emperor's broader aim of unifying Christendom against the Ottoman threat. That also required a French crusading participation. As we know from Nicopolis and Varna, that wouldn't actually be particularly successful endeavors. Also, they had a prominent Burgundian element, but in general, there was some broader need of settlement pacification. Henry invested in the prestigious Order of the Garter, reciprocated by joining Sigismund's Order of the Dragon. Signaling ambitions for a crusade, he, however, never pursued, also because he would unfortunately not live too long after this. The Treaty of Canterbury, signed on August 15, 1416, formalized an alliance between England and the Holy Roman Empire anyway, isolating France diplomatically. So basically, Henry was, at this point, signaled as a potential leader, also in an international sense, given his, again, imperium manifested on the Battle of Agincourt. And so with this sacred aura, it could be properly galvanizing for the crusading commitment across Europe. Consider that this is also the period of the Hussite crusade. It's a mess also for Sigismund in Central Europe, and definitely not such a great time in European history after all. But as we've seen, also a moment of recovery by some other standards. Henry secured naval dominance by defeating a Franco-Genoese fleet at the Battle of the Seine mouth, where on August 15th of 1416, 1 year after Agincourt, or even less, this was important, very important on a regional level, because it relieved the besieged English garrison at Harfleur and ensured control of the channel. The French had historically not just used the Genoese admirals, ships, and marines that were among the best in Europe to counter the English, but had also been ravaging the southern English coastland historically. So this English naval victory secured a very important stability for continuing further campaigns from England to France. In 1417, in fact, Henry launched a second, more ambitious campaign to conquer lower Normandy, right? So the estuary of the Seine, proper landing with an army approximately of 12,000 men. This brought to the siege of Caen that began on August the 18th, 1417. Part of the reason why he started so late is that the English realized the general French strategic superiority, so they basically punctured this French fringe late enough to sort of create some even level of surprise and or belating the French response. As we've seen, Agincourt was fought well into the midst of autumn, and on this occasion, Henry, as you understand here, quite an experienced leader by now, demonstrated his mastery of siege warfare. He utilized massive artillery, including large cannons mounted on the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen. The French garrison, led by Guillaume de Montenay, resisted fiercely, employing counter-mines to disrupt English tunneling efforts. Because Caen, as you know, was a pretty robust fortress historically. However, the lower town of Caen fell on September the 4th after intense fighting led by Henry's brother Thomas, the Duke of Clarence. The sack of this of the town was brutal. We're talking about 1,800 to 2,000 civilians killed by the English. This was really, really raw. Though Henry ordered at least women and clergy to be spared to limit at least accusations of indiscriminate cruelty. The castle surrendered on September the 20th, and Henry established a colonial administration settling English families in vacated homes to secure the city. The effort was obviously to broader, to colonize, to politically, strategically garrisoning this place with sort of more consensus from the local inhabitants that obviously were not happy at this point of this English presence that historically was becoming ever more brutal. I mean, these were the places from which the fact the French kings had been conquering England and historically came back, etc. But aside from the fact that Normandy was now ruled by the Capetians from quite a while, in general, even any Norman autonomistic desire was curbed by the sheer brutality. Now the ever more English, ever more British nobility from the other side of the channel was demonstrating like with low consideration and even contempt towards this Romance population. Subsequent conquests of Argentan, Falaise, and Cherbourg followed, exploiting divisions between the French, Burgundian, and Armagnac factions. The Valois-Burgundy were, as you know, essentially pursuing a parallel policy to the King of France, while still being essentially royalty themselves. They were more tied with Flanders. They had, in this sense, more interest in maintaining a sort of pressure on Paris and pursuing some further autonomy in their state building between France and the Holy Roman Empire. We made multiple videos about the states of Burgundy. We will come back on them as well. Also their warfare, because definitely the Burgundians capitalize upon especially this moment, as you know, is the highest moment of highest crisis in French up to 1429. These 10 years will be really crucial with the fall of Paris and so on. There's also the siege of Rouen. So these are old Norman centers that aim properly at consolidating control over the entire province and thwarting French efforts at reconquest as a bridgehead, again, a launching pad for further chevauchée, conquest, etc., into the French heartland. The siege of Rouen began in July 1418. It was Henry's most formidable operation, targeting Normandy's by now capital and a symbol of French resistance in general, because the city had proven loyal to the French crown, lasting until January 1419, which was relatively rare. Like sieges hardly were protracted across the year, right? Especially during winter, but it really employed ruthless starvation tactics, with Henry expelling non-combatants from the city to conserve resources as well. Thousands perished in the ditches outside the walls, contributing to an estimated 35,000 deaths, right? If we talk, of course, also the civilians. A grim testament to the siege's brutality. Rouen's fall, marked by the execution of resistors like Alain Blanchard, secured Normandy for England at the moment. There is a massive comeback. This is greatly also happening in the strategic wake of Agincourt outcome. The French had been bled, if not white, probably they had been partially decapitated. Again, the clashes between the Armagnac and Bourguignon happened exactly also because of the great amount of losses from on the first side at Agincourt. By August 1419, Henry's forces had advanced to the gates of Paris, simply rising up the Seine after these Norman victories, capitalizing on the subsequent French disarray after all these defeats. This was a paralysis of the French crown that was mixed also together with lots of other bloodshed. For example, the assassination of John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, was carried out by partisans of the Dauphin Charles on September the 10th, 1419. This famously happened at the bridge of Montereau. It was basically butchery and treachery. In a sense, it was an ambush. And it's a very famous example of this very internecine clash among probably the English royals. And it shifted, however, the balance in favor of the Armagnac, and so the royal faction. Because those guys were pressing to have some sort of power sharing over France with the English, and it was naturally intolerable to a degree. The Burgundians, enraged by the murder, however, allied further now with Henry, sealing this political alignment, paving the way to the Treaty of Troyes that was signed on May the 21st, 1420. This landmark agreement recognized Henry as a regent and heir to the French throne, designating the Dauphin, because remember here there's the king who's mad and incapacitated, and so there's this great ambassador. The Dauphin is the future Charles VII, the one of Joan of Arc, etc. So this is a pretty messy moment for the French, but there's also an important core that resists, in spite of the French being dislodged from central positions in the kingdom. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance was further cemented through Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois on June 2nd, 1420, and their son, the future Henry VI, born on December 6th, 1421, symbolized the hope for a dynastic union of the English and French crowns under the Lancaster house. This is very important because, again, Paris was lost to the French. There was all a phase that also basically in overlaps with Henry's own death, as we will see now, amidst, again, pretty heavy blows also for him in this last moments. In fact, militarily speaking, given that what we're focusing on here, Henry's final campaign began in 1421, prompted by the death of his own brother Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, who in fact was killed at the Battle of Beaujeu on March the 22nd. This was a rare English defeat in this context that, however, emboldened the French, returning to France with fresh forces after his brother's death in the continent. Henry besieged Dreux and Meaux, capturing the latter May the 10th, 1422, after yet another grueling winter siege that tested his army's endurance. This also showed how robust, to some degree, the French resolve was in different circumstances, especially in castles, in town defenses. We documented this also in other videos. Essentially, the French permanent forces were forming with the Compagnie d'Ordonnance was conceived properly as a billeted force in these centers that was not to venture out there, just protecting it and its countryside when possible from probably the English attacks. And it formed all a cornerstone of a defensive net that could not prevent Paris to be lost, but still maintaining important connections all across the northern France, with especially Orléans, where the royalists, the French royals retreated to. By the way, this is when the campaign and this terrible siege took a toll on Henry's health, likely weakened by dysentery, contracted at Meaux, recurring scourges we've seen also in the previous campaigns and in medieval armies in general, and this was exacerbated by a heat stroke, yet another frequent, malaise suffered during a march in full armor. Right, this happened. There are people in combat that literally died out of just not of heat strokes, but literally dehydrated. There are people who died on the spot just in the moment because they were traumatized by the entire psychophysical pressure. We have lots of evidence of this in medieval warfare. Stricken with fever, so you imagine psychophysical exhaustion of a completely strained body, but is titanic, efforts, Henry died on August 31st, 1422, at the castle of Vincennes. He was 35, just weeks before, by the way, the death of Charles VI of France, which opened a major turning point, again, the rise of Charles VII, and in the later years also of Joan of Arc, and so all another phase, descending one for the French, even though in the following years things seemed to go fairly well. Henry's body was embalmed. This was, successfully done, because at least the season was coming to an end. Normally, especially in the hottest moments of the season, bodies had to be literally boiled, and basically just like some parts, the interiors were preserved in some ways, mostly the bones preserved. This had been the fate of, Frederick Barbarossa, Louis IX, etc. And so Henry's corpse was transported through Normandy and buried in Westminster Abbey on November the 7th of the same year, near his friend Bishop Richard Courtenay, who, as we've seen, had died of dysentery at Harfleur in 1415, so they were sort of twained by this grim end. Henry's death marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War, as we just profiled. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited both the English and French crowns under a regency led by Henry's brothers, John, Duke of Bedford, who was the guy who basically ruled also in northern France. Paris had to properly officiate certain practices, like including funeral French kings and so on. So it was a very, of Charles VI, as we were saying here, that died shortly afterwards. Also Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, that we mentioned before. These were, again, Henry's brothers, and they took control. Bedford expanded English control in France, capturing key towns like Compiègne and Dieppe in the northeast. Also backed by the Burgundians, and mostly supported them from that side. But as you know, there would be a French coming back under Charles VII, galvanized by the very mystical figure of Joan of Arc, that successfully reversed most of Henry's gains, that had probably been the most successful in the 100 Years' War. If you look at it from a more of a strategical standpoint, also from a political point of view, basically they had managed to obtain the French crown, like to dynastically unite the English and the French crowns. But the Capetian Valois reconquest was successful in expelling them once again. By 1458, England retained only Calais. Naturally, we're talking about lots of things happen. I made a bit about the Battle of Châtillon, for example. We'll talk about also other clashes, probably in the end. But this obviously starkly contrasts just a generation later to the vast territories that Henry had held at his death. Henry was, again, an all-around king. Today we've seen just like the military side of the story. It is the most important, admittedly. But, for example, he was an architectural patron. He included, he brought to the foundation of King's College Chapel in Cambridge and the Sion Abbey. He left a lasting cultural legacy, reflecting his piety and commitment to education, but also a unitary vision of stronger English monarchy. Henry's military triumphs, so we've seen basically Shrewsbury, Agincourt, Caen, Rouen, and diplomatic success, such as the Treaty of Troyes, remain the cornerstones of his legacy that occurred just after a premature death. Like, we can't wonder what would have happened had he survived, really. He surely would have accomplished something great as well. Contemporary chroniclers such as Thomas Walsingham in the St. Alban Chronicle and French sources like Jean Vavron and Enguerrand de Monstrelet praised the English king's valor, piety, and strategic brilliance. They portrayed him as a model Christian king. Some scholars have pointed out that he was sort of a pretty militaristic leader to an extent. He was depicted as a ruthless aggressor, especially the cruelty of the English as a whole in the brutal sieges of Caen and Rouen. They did not have to be forgotten, right? Of course, there was a mix of reasons, but that was happening. We can't praise Henry's tactical genius, but obviously he was pretty a calculator, right? He was pretty cruelly calculating these moves for purposes that were, however, politically and strategically successful at large. So you can't criticize it on moral ground, but to what end? It's not like other rulers were doing anything particularly different. If anything, Henry seems to have incarnated a pretty sort of high and advanced level of sort of traditional knightly, monarchic, warlike, and also innovatively national and somehow international as well vision, right, of almost imperial, universal grandeur. So his life cut short by illness and the military campaign is just a byproduct of this incredibly brutal and chaotic situation that he was, in any case, incredibly apt to navigate. Henry, therefore, stands as a testament, especially due to his victory, to a burgeoning sense of English national identity, on which he left, in fact, a pretty profound impact. He fostered a sense of unity and martial pride that endured beyond his reign. The Battle of Agincourt is almost a fairy tale battle, or at least one of high sort of military recognition of valor, of honor, still speak of chivalry, of courage, of inspiration. It was a disaster for the French. It became a symbol of English prowess. There is properly also an identity stemming, especially among the English country gentry, regarding the use, for example, of the longbow, which is part of the reason why we are constantly annoyed by this notion that the longbow did the thing. No, it didn't. Again, but this is somehow a distinctive element of Englishness that was, for example, Churchill in his historical works very much praised, naturally in the mindset of someone brought up in a positivistic era, and that was appreciating. I mean, he created tank warfare basically during World War I, but you can understand how he would appreciate this almost, again, this technological bias, but it's not really what happened in the 15th century. So Henry's reign, true brief, and you want to appreciate that too, that it's not like brief to the point that we don't know how he would have handled difficult situations, because what he did, even in this short time, was nothing short of amazing, enormous in scale, and incredibly successful. It transformed England's self-perception, embedding a narrative of resilience and ambition that influenced military and political thought for centuries. This was the highest point of the 100 Years' War for everybody involved, and obviously the upper hand for the English in that political and strategical sense. And so despite the eventual loss of his French conquests and the English defeat in the 100 Years' War, Henry V's legacy as a warrior king endures, right? Celebrated in chronicles, literature, you name them. Here we're not even talking Shakespeare, but in general, you know what we're talking about. There is a collective memory of the English nation incarnated by Henry V. That he himself successfully contributed to unify and elevate as one of the most important in European history. Even though, again, England would basically, with the same decline of the later war after Henry's own death, would also withdraw from essentially the European continental scenario. Like basically until the mid-17th century, England was lagging behind the rest of Europe, but it still sort of contributed to spiritually and even and nationally elevate the mythology of the English monarchy and state, right? So that that the English had a very sort of hiddenly also complicated relation with their monarchy, due to the fact that they actually had a revolution, which they tried to hide, especially after the French one, because they didn't want to have what the French had. But at the same time, the fact being able to condense such level of all these elements to truly develop a more unitary view and a successful one, and especially the military legacy of Henry V is immense, right? Forgive me if this video does not cover this. I can't stress it enough. We will see it better naturally in the tactical reconstruction of the Battle of Agincourt at some point. The cycle will extract that sooner or later. But I was very glad to discuss Henry V because, again, we had never really done that, and I really want to make more about not just the 100 Years' War, but probably about medieval English warfare, which, especially in the later Middle Ages, is quite interesting for a number of reasons, and hopefully also a more accurate and objective approach to the medieval art of war through English warfare can help understanding not just a lot about it, but about probably the entirety of European warfare during these years. So again, colossal figure, hell of a ruler, hero, king, knight, champion, more, etc. Great general strategist, tactician, leader from the front on the battlefield, in the blooded mud, together with his brothers in arms, according to the immortalization in Shakespeare's speech. In any case, we will talk about him again, hopefully soon. Might we want to do so, but there is also a lot of other medieval English leaders too. I want to start a series on the Black Prince for that matter, because he is just like yet another of these sort of mythological heroes in medieval English warfare. We will talk also about French warfare, because that's heavily underrated and underappreciated for the actually high quality that it had, even in this catastrophic defeats that were not naturally random, but they were also not just to happen just because, all right? It must be understood, and in tactical reconstruction we'll see how also normal the situation was. Also the notion that, again, the English armies were particularly different in tactics or technicalities compared to the other European ones, not just the French, is erroneous. And it takes a lot of merit away of the same English quality, leadership, discipline, etc., which is the thing that actually made it, and not some other, again, deterministic, materialistic superstition. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.